Story 1. Back in the warehouse days, we had an ever-growing clearance section. Because of this, the company employed a delivery driver to be solely responsible for delivering clearance items purchased by customers. This delivery driver, let's call him John, was amazing. He was a veteran of the industry, had 2 trucks, one smaller and one larger, and did most of the heavy lifting. He always took the time to chat with me as I helped him load up his delivery run. He would even bring me a cold drink when it was an extremely hot day, knowing I had been working very hard. John had worked for several high-end furniture stores, but when the recession hit and companies either went out of business or cut costs, he found himself struggling to find work. The company I worked for had an issue with delivery drivers because they were cheap and wouldn't pay the industry standard rates most drivers charged. John was happy to make a few concessions for under-the-table deliveries, and naturally, management took advantage of that. After a few issues in the warehouse, I asked John if I could get a few shifts working for him as his delivery assistant. John immediately said yes, as he had his own problems with lazy employees. I quickly fell in love with the work. We would start at 4 a.m. to get deliveries ready by 6 a.m. And if we scheduled everything correctly, we could be done by 2 or 2:30 p.m. I enjoyed the physical nature of the job, loved being on the open road, and enjoyed swapping stories with John. He would talk about his wife and kids, and I'd poke fun at his outdated scorpion tattoo. The problems began when John would receive his delivery run sheet from the store and see the prices quoted to the customers by the manager. To give you an idea, the store charged $95 for a local delivery, and this was with a full day of deliveries, around 20 to 30 in total. John charged slightly more because he was doing maybe 5 to 8 deliveries, and they were spread all over the place rather than concentrated in one area. John would go in and ask the manager why a customer was only being charged $50 for a 3-seater sofa bed, going up 6 flights of stairs, when it normally would be a $110 delivery charge, plus an additional $100 for every flight of stairs past the first level. The manager would just shrug and say she reduced the delivery fee to close the sale. We had other deliveries where we would have to carry a 10-piece sectional sofa up 7 flights of stairs because the customer didn't reserve an elevator, or the goods wouldn't fit in the lift. We'd get the sofa inside, unbag it, connect the sections, and take the trash away, only for the customer to hand John $30 in cash. It was soul-crushing. I remember getting the customer to sign off on the paperwork while John said he'd meet me back at the truck. I grabbed the last bit of trash, made my way downstairs, and jumped into the passenger seat. John was trying not to look at me. He had been crying. I asked if he was okay, and he broke down a little, confessing to me that he was struggling with bills. The company I worked for was his only decent-paying job, but he was getting mistreated by the manager, and he might have to sell his trucks to pay his bills. My heart went out to him. John was becoming a fast friend, and he genuinely loved his job. I began to hatch a plan based on my inside knowledge of the manager, the area manager, the general manager, and the company overall. I took John to a small bar, and we had a few drinks while I laid out my plan for revenge. I asked John why he didn't give the manager a price list and charge more for his deliveries. John explained that if he did that, the manager had threatened to drop him as their driver and find someone cheaper. I laughed and told him to call her now and quit. I explained that we had seen the run sheet for tomorrow, and it was a massive run, 10 deliveries, and we already knew the manager had quoted ridiculously low prices, like $20 per delivery. John was hesitant, but I assured him that any other contract driver would charge at least $200 per delivery, and no one would touch this company with those prices. John got on the phone, called the manager on speaker, and quit right then and there. The manager, as expected, talked a big game, claiming they'd be better off without John, and that he had just lost his biggest contract. John hung up, looking sick and panicked. I reassured him that it would be okay. I checked my watch. The store closed at 5 p.m., and it was currently 1 p.m. I promised John that by 4 p.m. he'd get a call back from the manager. In the meantime, we created a new list of demands, including preset prices provided by John, covering John's assistant and gas, and additional fees for difficult deliveries like balcony lifts or fire escapes. If they wanted to terminate John, they'd have to give appropriate notice. Sure enough, at 4:30 p.m., John's phone rang. It was the manager, who offered a much more polite tone and even a $50 store gift card if John would do the deliveries the next day. I hung up the call for him. John looked at me in disbelief. I told him that when she called back, he should lay out his demands. 5 minutes later, his phone rang again. John answered, and the manager began her usual spiel, but John cut her off, listing the problems he had with the company. At first, he was nervous, but then the months of being mistreated kicked in, and he laid down the law like a champion. The manager tried to brush off John's request, but I encouraged him to continue. He calmly explained that no other contract driver would get out of bed for less than $250 per delivery, and she had to either agree to his demands or find someone else. The manager reluctantly agreed. John and I went to the store, and the manager was furious. She complained that John was extorting her, but John calmly handed over the contract he had written up and told her to sign it. She did, and John backed his truck into the warehouse. The next day was glorious. Most of the customers' goods wouldn't fit because the manager hadn't told them to measure their door frames. Customers screamed at us, calling it unfair that they had to pay more than $20. We just laughed and complied with the manager's directive, leaving the furniture at the property. For the nice customers who had cash ready and were happy to pay us for our efforts, we went the extra mile to ensure they had the best delivery experience possible. Update on John. After I quit my warehouse job and landed a few acting gigs, I finally secured a role on a prominent series. I managed to talk to one of the producers about John, and he ended up getting a job picking up sets from the studio warehouse and transferring them to the studio. He now works with the night crew to erect the sets and prepare them for the next day's shooting. I see him around the studio lot between setups, and he's doing great. He's making good money, comfortably supporting his family, and putting his kids through school. And, of course, there's still a well-earned cold drink at the end of the day. Story 2. This took place around 2008. My buddy, Brock, had recently left the military after serving for 10 years. He started in the Marine Corps but transitioned into the Army for the last 4 years before purchasing a house in Texas. After leaving the service, he worked various jobs before landing a position with a repossession service. He worked there for about a year and had plenty of wild stories, but this one stands out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get some justice on a spiteful ex. One day, Brock was at the office, speaking with his manager, whom I'll refer to as Karen. Now, this particular Karen had many characteristics typical of the name, but she was actually on the side of good, if you can believe that. While they were talking, a young man walked into the office. He immediately caught their attention because he had 2 black eyes and his arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I never learned but will call Ben, asked how difficult it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called in her daughter, Karen Jr., and asked her to pour Ben a cup of coffee. Afterward, she asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben explained that he had just returned from a deployment. He had been dating a local woman who lived near the well-known Fort Hood, which he admitted wasn't the best idea. During a previous deployment, he had saved enough money to buy himself a used black Dodge Charger, which he loved dearly. He further explained that, not long after purchasing the car, he met the local woman, who I will call Morgan for the sake of the story. Morgan was always asking to drive his car, but he would decline. When his next deployment was approaching, Morgan asked again if she could borrow the car, and despite his initial refusals, he eventually relented, but only on the condition that she take care of his apartment while he was away. She agreed. Ben left for his deployment, leaving Morgan in charge of his place. When he returned for a brief rest and relaxation leave, he found his apartment spotless. He retrieved his car from storage and drove to Morgan's place. After spending a few days with her, he handed over the keys and headed to his home state to visit family before returning to complete his deployment. But when he finally came back from deployment, trouble awaited him. When Ben walked into his apartment, he found a thick layer of dust on almost every surface, as if no one had been there for months. Upon checking his bedroom, he discovered that it had been ransacked, with drawers pulled out and overturned. He tried calling Morgan, but she never answered. Fortunately, his safe, which was hidden, remained untouched. He retrieved his spare car key from the safe and, along with a friend, drove to Morgan's place. When they arrived, Ben saw a car in the driveway that he initially didn't recognize. As they got closer, he realized it was his Dodge Charger, but it had been painted bright pink and outfitted with 24-inch spinner wheels. He tried the key just to confirm, and sure enough, the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his friend laughed, Ben walked up to Morgan's front door, and when she answered, he asked what happened to his car. Morgan simply replied, "It's my car now." Ben walked back to the car, but before he could drive off, 4 large men, one of whom was carrying a baseball bat, came out of Morgan's house. They yanked him out of the car and beat him in the driveway. Ben's friend intervened, pulling out his concealed carry firearm to stop the attack, and then took Ben to the hospital. I'm not sure if the police were called, but Ben mentioned that his friend drove past Morgan's house a few times while Ben was in the hospital, and the car was never there. Karen listened intently before asking for the paperwork. Ben handed it over, and a smile spread across Karen's face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben provided it, unaware of what was about to unfold. Karen handed the phone to her daughter, Karen Jr., who dialed the number. Pretending to be someone Morgan met at a local club, Karen Jr. asked if Morgan was interested in going out that night. Morgan agreed, and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up in the bright pink Charger, parked it, and went inside with some friends. Brock waited 5 minutes before stealthily driving up, hooking the car, and pulling away. As he was leaving, Morgan ran out of the club, trying to flag him down, but he was already gone. The next day, things were business as usual at the office when Morgan called, furious that her car had been stolen and demanding it back. Karen, in her best customer service voice, told her that if she had the registration, she could come pick it up. Morgan began screaming that she would call the police, to which Karen sarcastically responded, "Please do," before hanging up. As the phone call was happening, Brock noticed Morgan standing near a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a tantrum. After Karen hung up, she had Brock verify that it was indeed Morgan. Karen then called the owner of the property where Morgan and her friend were parked, informing him about the situation. The owner gave permission to have the car towed. Brock drove over to the lot, introduced himself, and told Morgan and her friend they couldn't park there. They argued and called him every name in the book, but Brock hooked the car up anyway, lifting it partially off the ground. This forced the two to exit the vehicle. They continued to yell at Brock until he showed them the tow order. While this exchange was happening, Ben arrived at the office, and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door while Brock lowered the car. Inside the office, things had escalated. Morgan tried to grab the keys from Ben, but he pocketed them. She then hit Ben in his injured arm and threatened to have her friends finish the job if she didn't get her keys back. By this time, Karen Jr. had already called the police, and Brock stepped in between Ben and Morgan, daring her to hit him instead. Morgan, now switching to the pity card, claimed she only wanted the keys to get her laptop for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys to Brock, who then retrieved the laptop from the car. As he was handing it over, Morgan aggressively lunged for it, knocking the laptop from his hands. Completely frustrated, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to take legal action. Just then, the police arrived, and Morgan began her tearful story, claiming the car was stolen. The officers questioned Karen, who casually asked if they wanted to see the security footage. The police watched the video, which showed Morgan hitting Ben multiple times and making threats about sending her friends after him. At this point, Morgan's demeanor changed. She turned pale and tried to slip out, but the police stopped her. They questioned her about the car, Ben's injuries, and her threats. She denied everything, but the evidence was already against her. Morgan was arrested, and Ben got his car back. Later, Ben admitted he didn't want to be seen driving a car that looked like it was promoting a pink medicine brand, so he planned to trade it in for something else. Word eventually got around that the 4 men who attacked Ben were arrested too. Morgan had ratted them out. Brock had many more stories, but none quite as satisfying as this one. Story 3. Half of my coworkers got stuck at a conference due to the hurricane, so the rest of us have been pulling ridiculous shifts to cover. I don't mind the overtime, and it couldn't be helped, so it is what it is. Yesterday, I worked 12 hours, after having worked 12 the 2 days prior, and knowing I'd have another 12-hour shift today, last one. Yay! Honestly, it wasn't horrible, but yes, I was exhausted, which is why I ended up doing what I did in this story. I changed out of my work shirt before leaving the building, so I was wearing jeans and a tie-dye t-shirt when I stumbled like a zombie into a fast food place to grab something to eat. I got my food and tucked myself into a corner to eat. At one point, I heard some commotion but ignored it. As I was getting up to throw out my trash, I heard an old man shout, she should be fired." Things were going down, and my curiosity got the better of me, so I looked over, and to my surprise, the man was pointing at me with an incredibly angry expression. I glanced behind me, but no one was there. Oh no, he was definitely pointing at me. He started yelling about how he had been there yesterday and how rude the cashier was, claiming that I messed up his order. I was half asleep and utterly confused, so I looked at the manager with a "what is going on" expression, and he gave me an apologetic, "I have no idea" look. The old man continued his rant when the manager finally said, "Sir, I'd love to help you sort this out, but she doesn't work here. I can help you figure out who it was, but it wasn't her." As is typical in situations like these, the old man didn't listen. "No, I know it was her. I wouldn't forget that mean face." By now, I was fully awake and getting more frustrated. "Well, apparently, you did because I don't work here and never have." Not wanting to waste more time, I gave the manager a look that said, "Good luck with this," and started walking toward the door. Then, the unbelievable happened. This man threw a chair at me. A chair. It didn't hit me, but he definitely tried. Things got chaotic, but the manager quickly grabbed the man in a bear hug and walked him toward the door, saying, "That's it, you're out of here. If you come back again, I'm calling the cops." That's if she doesn't call them first for trying to hit her with a chair. The old man mumbled something about, "She turned her back to me. Let me go." The manager responded with, "That's not how this works." Honestly, it was all happening so fast, and I was still a bit out of it. I have to give credit to the manager. He got that man away from me, his employees, and the other customers, including a few kids, in a matter of seconds. The manager shoved the man outside, still shouting, and held the door shut. He then offered me all the free food in the world and said he'd happily help me press charges. Had the man just left, I might have let it go. But he continued banging on the door and yelling, so we had no choice but to call the cops to remove him. While we waited, the manager mentioned the security cameras and sent someone to pull up the footage so the police could see everything. When the cops arrived, they cuffed the man and started asking questions. The old man lied through his teeth, claiming that I threw the chair and that the manager had assaulted him, even lying about being my boss. Luckily, it was easy to prove otherwise with the camera footage. The old man ended up being arrested and taken to jail on several charges. After one cop left with the man, another stayed to take our statements. For a bit of amusement, they also tried to figure out which cashier had supposedly been so rude to the old man. It turns out that only male employees had worked the entire day. They couldn't even find any record of the old man being there. We're pretty sure he never actually came in. As I was finally leaving, one of the cops jokingly asked, "You sure you don't work here?" I lost it and started laughing. I asked if he wanted me to show him how to make a chair fly, and he laughed too. Edit. Many people have mentioned that this sounds like the man may have Alzheimer's or dementia. This morning, I found his mugshot, which helped me uncover more information about him. Over the past 20 years, records aren't updated beyond that. He has been charged with assault 4 times, trespassing twice, a random incident involving impaired driving, and resisting arrest 6 times. So, out of 7 arrests, he resisted all but 1. In short, this guy just seems to have a history of bad behavior. I've been going through comments throughout the day, so apologies if I don't get to yours. Thanks for reading, everyone. I thought this story would be interesting for the community, but I didn't expect it to get this much attention. Edit 2. No, I'm not dating the cop now, sorry to disappoint. He's around 20 years old and married. Also, no, I'm not from Minnesota. I just love the phrases they use there. The chair has been retired and will live out the rest of its days in peace. Edit 3. Hopefully, this will be the last edit unless there's an update. I wouldn't sue the fast food place because they didn't do anything wrong. In fact, they've been incredibly kind to me. One of the higher-ups even mentioned covering therapy costs if I needed it. It sounds silly to me because I'm not hurt or traumatized, and this has actually become a great story to share like with you all. Yay! I know it wouldn't really affect the company or its employees, and it wouldn't do anything to the old man either. It wouldn't even teach the company a lesson because they already trained their staff to react the right way. If anything, I'll be testifying in court against the old man, hoping he's kept away from the public for as long as the law allows. With all his previous charges, he'll likely face the maximum punishment. Story 4. I am a military veteran who was injured during my time in Iraq, and I mention this because it's important to the story. I worked for what I'll call a company, though in reality, it was just a man who owned several businesses. He happened to be the wealthiest person in a very small town. To understand how I ended up in this situation, I'll give you a quick background before we get to the main story. I joined the military before completing high school, late birthdays, and all that. I chose a military career I knew I'd enjoy, so I became a mechanic, a field I had a passion for. It came with a great sign-on bonus, which was a big plus. During basic training, I only spent money on necessities, so I saved up quite a bit. By the time I finished advanced training for my job, I had half of my sign-on bonus and nearly an entire year's pay in my account. Most people my age would have splurged, but I invested in the stock market, some emerging digital currency, and I paid off my parents' house. A couple of deployments later, I received the other half of my bonus. Other than essentials, the only real indulgence I had was my hot rod. Needless to say, I had some money saved up and invested it as well. By the time I was discharged, I was financially comfortable, even after a nasty divorce. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't have an absurd amount of money, but enough to live comfortably. However, because of the divorce, I had to cash out a lot of stocks and split assets. Anyone who has followed that digital currency market over the past decade knows how that roller coaster turned out. After the divorce, I worked to rebuild what I lost. But mainly, I worked just to keep busy. I love being a mechanic, so I bounced around from job to job because a good mechanic can make money anywhere. After a decade of this, I decided to settle in a small, quiet town. By this point, I was tired of constantly working on other people's cars and wanted to focus on my own. I bought a small house and noticed a help wanted sign at the local lube shop. Figuring it would be simple work to cover my few expenses, I decided to apply. When I grabbed an application from the office, I got all kinds of looks from the locals. For context, I'm 6'3", and since leaving the military, I've let my hair grow out, stopped shaving, and have a full tattoo sleeve. People generally cross the street to avoid walking past me. When I turned in my application to the bookkeeper, let's call her Sue, she noticed I had checked the box indicating I was a veteran. She marked something on my application and asked me a few questions. Later that day, Sue called and asked if I could come back in to meet the owner, who we'll call Peter. I agreed, and Sue said Peter would be there in an hour to discuss the position. When I arrived, Peter's eyes widened when he first saw me, but we got to chatting, and my southern charm won him over. He handed me a calendar featuring his car collection and asked if I could identify the cars. There were a couple of Mustangs, a Ford GT, a a Bricklin SV1, a Judge, a Demon, a Pantera, and an MXD. Peter was impressed that I knew what the SV1 was, and we talked cars for a while. He offered me the position, explaining that I'd be paid $100 a day and work Monday through Saturday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. There would be no overtime. But I'd still receive a full day's pay even if we closed early. I would have Sundays off and one additional day during the week. It was a great start, and I worked there for about a year without any issues. Then Peter asked if I could help out by being a relief worker for his other lube shops in neighboring towns. He offered to give me $20 extra each day for travel, and my role would be to cover for employees who needed time off. I agreed and did this for another year, but then disaster struck. Peter met Karen. Peter fell head over heels for Karen, and within a month, they were married. This is when the problems began. One week, I noticed my paycheck was only $250, so I asked Sue about it. She told me there had been some changes, and I should speak with Peter. No problem, I thought, so I called Peter and asked if we could discuss it. He showed up with Karen, and when I asked about the short pay, Peter said the business was affected by bad weather and early closures. I would have let it go, but Karen interjected. "It's not fair to pay you for a full day when you don't work the full 10 hours, she said. I responded that I was on a negotiated day rate, not an hourly wage, and if they were paying me by the day, then I shouldn't be penalized for early closures. She disagreed and claimed that from now on, I would be paid only for the hours I worked. Fine, whatever, Karen. Fast forward to the next week. We had a full week of very busy days, staying open later than usual to finish with customers, and I gave up one of my days off to cover for a sick coworker. So, when I expected an $800 paycheck and only received $600, I had more questions. I called Peter and asked why I was shorted, and he just said, "That's what we agreed on, $100 a day." I reminded him of the extra hours, and he brushed it off with a simple, "It is what it is." I was getting aggravated. At that point, Karen walked in and asked, "What's he complaining about now?" I coldly told her I had worked 80 hours and was only paid $600. She retorted, "You're contracted labor. You agreed to $100 a day, so why would we pay you more than that?" I looked at Peter and asked if that was how it was going to be. His only response was, "You heard her." I went home and convinced myself that I was only working to cover my few living expenses. The job wasn't that hard, and the only other options in that small town were assembling sheds or working at the local chicken plant. The next week, one of my coworkers got yelled at by Karen in front of customers for what she claimed was a safety violation. She insisted that as part owner of the company, it was her responsibility to ensure all safety regulations were met, and the violation was the worker wearing tinted safety glasses. This was ridiculous because the bays faced east and west, and depending on the time of day, the workers were constantly exposed to direct sunlight. As I walked by, shaking my head, Karen noticed and shouted at me. "Got something to say, big guy?" I just kept walking. I later told Sue that she needed to have a serious talk with Peter before Karen's attitude caused bigger problems. Sue simply said, "I just keep the books, don't involve me." This went on for another year, and I finally reached my limit. On the day I decided to take action, I was in a terrible mood. I had just received news that a good friend of mine, who had saved my life during our deployment in Iraq, had been killed by a drunk driver. Not wanting to deal with anyone, I told the shop I'd be working in the pit all day and to just leave me alone. The guys I worked with had known me for years and could tell something was wrong. I never expected to have to deal with Karen that day, especially since I was working at the farthest shop from the main one. But I wasn't so lucky, or maybe I was. Peter and Karen showed up, and she stormed into the pit, yelling for Peter to come look at this mess. I had no idea what she was talking about since I always kept my area clean. Her complaint was about 50 of the most commonly used oil filters being stacked on my waste drums for easy access. I did this all the time, and Peter knew about it and never cared before. But this time, he looked around and said, "Clean up this pigsty." I shook my head and told him, "Today's not the day, Peter." Move on and take her with you." Karen, furious, saw this as a huge disrespect and started yelling. Peter told me that if I didn't like it, I could leave, so I did. But this story doesn't end here. That was just the first spark in a series of events that would lead to a much bigger explosion. The next day, Peter called me and asked if I could stop by the main store on my way home. I thought he was going to apologize. Maybe one of the guys had told him why I was so on edge the day before. But no, Peter informed me that I would be on probation for 6 months for my behavior, during which I would only be paid $50 a day and wouldn't receive the $20 travel stipend for covering other shops. I asked if he was serious and if he had really thought this through. That's when Peter's true colors showed. He told me I was lucky not to be fired for my constant disrespect toward him and Karen, and that the only reason he hadn't was because he pitied me as a struggling disabled veteran. I never once discussed my finances with anyone at work, so I could only assume Peter thought I was broke based on my appearance. Something inside me snapped. I laughed and told him, "You should reconsider your life choices and who you go into business with." Peter responded, "What? Are you going to sue me? Go ahead, if you think you can afford it. I know what you get from the government, what? Maybe $1,000 a month. I know you need this job." That wasn't my plan, but it sure was now. I immediately contacted a labor lawyer, paid the $3,000 retainer, and began the process of suing for an unsafe work environment, unpaid overtime, and minimum wage violations, all while continuing to work for Peter. It was glorious, but still not enough. It took about 6 months for the paperwork to be completed and filed, as we slow-rolled it at my request. My lawyer, a fellow veteran, seemed to know exactly what I was planning. After everything was in place, my lawyer filed the lawsuit, and Peter and Karen were served at the main shop while I was at work. The process server stuck around as a witness because we knew things were about to escalate. When Peter and Karen read the lawsuit, they lost it. Peter shouted, "I should kick your behind, you ungrateful jerk," and Karen screamed, "You're fired, coward. I bet you weren't even really in the military." The process server recorded everything and handed the footage to my lawyer, who added unlawful termination to the lawsuit since it's illegal to fire someone for suing their employer. The next day, I opened my own lube shop and car wash combo. I started recruiting my former coworkers, offering them higher pay plus commission. They were eager to join the lawsuit, and my lawyer was happy to add them to the case. 2 years later, after subpoenaing security footage, company records, and sworn testimonies, we went to mediation. Peter and Karen offered a measly $50,000 to split between the 15 of us, which didn't even cover the unpaid overtime. We declined. But then, our secret weapon arrived: a report from the Internal Revenue Service, sent to my lawyer after we requested the company's tax documents. Peter had set up each lube shop as its own limited liability company, each with its own tax identification number and employment records. To save money, Peter and Karen filed for a tax credit for employing a veteran me, claiming I worked full-time at each shop for at least 36 hours a week at a rate of $12 an hour. At the next mediation, my lawyer presented the IRS reports to their lawyer and the mediator. After a brief 20-minute discussion, Peter and Karen returned, agreeing to settle at our request of $400,000 in unpaid overtime, split between the 15 of us, all legal fees, and a personal settlement of $20 for each shop I was listed as an employee at. Additionally, I was compensated for the 6 months I was paid below minimum wage. Their only demand was that we agree to a gag order, preventing us from discussing the settlement publicly. We signed and took our checks. However, somehow, the fraudulent tax paperwork found its way to the right person at the IRS, and they launched an investigation into Peter and Karen for tax fraud. I sold the shop to the guys who joined me in the lawsuit, each paying me $8,000, and I moved away. About 8 months later, I returned because the person I had hired to maintain my property had been arrested, and my yard hadn't been mowed for months. The city threatened to fine me $100 a day until it was brought up to code, so I went down to mow it myself. While there, I stopped by the realtor's office to check in, And guess who I saw? Sue, sitting at the front desk. Sue couldn't talk fast enough, eager to share what had happened. It turns out the tax situation was more like an atomic bomb than just a minor explosion. Peter had filed for bankruptcy to avoid going broke after making a plea deal for probation due to tax fraud. Karen had run off with some guy she met at a casino. I asked Sue 2 questions. Did she know who reported the fraudulent tax paperwork? And what happened to Peter's car collection? She said she had no idea and suggested I check behind the realtor's office. On my way out, I peeked around back and saw a safety green SV1 sitting there. Apparently, Peter had started selling off his cars early, hoping to buy them back after filing for bankruptcy. To this day, I don't know who, if anyone, reported the tax fraud to the IRS. My personal theory is that whoever was tasked with compiling the paperwork noticed something fishy and reported it. However it happened, it couldn't have happened to more deserving people.